So I grew up always like hiking and camping with my family, and I've always really liked that stuff. My aunt, who actually went on this trip with me, is really big into that, and she always did like adventure racing, and I always really looked up to her. So if she did it, I had to do it. Being out and exploring and like kind of testing your limits is a cool experience for some people. I know not everybody likes that, but for me, that's one of those kind of things that I enjoy doing. I've always been really curious about like crampons and ice axes and getting to use those and learn more. And I started looking at like bigger hiking trips and just trying to figure out what I could do. Did I want to go to Colorado? Did I want to go to Washington State? And different areas that way. And I found a guided trip up Mount Washington, which is known for some of the worst weather in the world, which is really cool. I saw in the thing that it said, you're gonna carry an ice axe and you're gonna have crampons on your feet. And I was like, yep, let's sign up for that. And that was what led me to Mount Washington. And that was just the stepping stone, if you will, to wanting to go bigger and taller and more adventurous things. I was lucky for this trip because I got to go with a guide. So they kind of hand you a list of things like, hey, you need to own X, Y, and Z things. And so then as long as you own everything on the list, they kind of do the rest of the work for you. But because the list is great, but I had so many questions and I really geek out over the gear, I wanted to know more. So I studied the weather patterns for each month of like what could be up there and how, what different trails are open. Are there glaciers? Are there, avalanche areas? Could we be in those avalanche areas? What is the terrain like? Looking at all sorts of websites that way. And then also like the gear, I love to research all that. So there was a huge component of that. Because I went up with one of my best friends and my aunt, they also didn't know it. So I would compile lists of, hey, I went on to a website that sells these kind of jackets and we need a jacket within this range. Here's the 10 jackets from that with the price range and what materials it's made out of and the color. Go pick one of them out and that should cover us for this component. I loved it. It was so much fun. I was constantly on my computer reading about a new jacket. I'd have to go to the nearest sporting store that I knew had it in stock and I had to like touch it and try it on and try the different sizes and go from there. Training wise, I didn't contact anybody. I did a lot of walking. I did a lot of like put the backpack on my back and just fill it with like water bottles so it was heavy and just go take my dogs for a walk. And I did a lot of stair stepper stuff. So because it was a guided trip, day one we met the guides. We all met at their kind of like base camp headquarters, and the guides took us through all of the equipment they would be carrying and then all of the equipment we would be carrying. And we just kind of checked it. And then we'd ask like, hey, I've got this base layer. Is this too much? Do we do more? Do we do less? And they would say, based on the weather tomorrow that we should see, you could probably get away with this, or yeah, not a bad idea to add an extra thing in. So we did all this step work for crampons, because when you walk on a crampon, you have basically 12 knives on the bottom of your feet, or 10 depending on the type of crampon you have, and your feet are bigger. And so now you're in a big mountaineering boot that's already a big, heavy, chunky boot with a sole that doesn't flex, or doesn't flex much. And then you put a piece of steel on the bottom of your feet and you're walking around in that. So you have to kind of learn how to like step through the ice and like kick into certain steps and do things. And then we weren't quite like fully rappelling where you think of like someone on the side of a mountain and they're, rappelling down. But we did stuff where it would maybe be a 20-foot drop where it was too far to like scramble and jump down. So we'd have a rope and we learned how to like kind of like inch and walk our way down that. So we did a lot of that kind of stuff just in case we ran into that the next day. We got really lucky, weather-wise we didn't need to, but it was still nice to have and know. Day two, which is the day that we actually made for the summit, we woke up probably about 3:30 in the morning because we had to be ready to go with all of our gear. Pretty much everything had been packed. We got in our clothes, and then the big thing we had to do is, because the weather can get so cold, your water can freeze up there. Because we didn't carry any like stoves or anything, we weren't gonna have time to melt it. So we had to make sure that we got down to the lobby, and got hot water into like all of our water bottles. And then we put our water bottles in these like neoprene sleeves to keep them warmer. So we do that. Everybody's like, the whole group is down because we all stayed at the same hotel. And then we met the guides, and then it was about an hour drive out. So we went, grabbed breakfast really quick, made it back, and then we hopped in the car and we drove out. And it was probably about 40 minutes for the drive. The temp starting there, I think, was maybe 35 to 40 degrees, so not bad. But once we got on the trail and we got up, it was starting to drop. So the higher you go, the colder it gets. And then because of the wind chill affects it massively. And especially with Mount Washington is built at the end of a ravine. So it's in a mountain range. It's the presidential mountain range, part of the White Mountains. And the mountains just in front of it make this like kind of ravine like funnel. And so there's two different like weather fronts that meet at the top of it. And then there's one more that funnels down the funnel. And so it jams basically like three different weather fronts right there. And because of the height of the clouds versus the height of the mountain, it like swirls it and just makes chaos on the mountain. So we kept going up. The biggest one that we stopped at is the hut. And the hut is just outside of the alpine zone, or like inside the alpine zone. So you start in the woods, you're climbing through like a hiking trail, what most people would think of as just a hiking trail. We hiked over frozen waterfalls and different things like that. And then you leave the tree zone, like the zone where trees can grow. And that is the alpine zone. So basically from there, there's not really vegetation. A little bit here and there, but there's not a lot. And after that spot, you're very open. You're out in the open. So like if the weather turns, you got to figure out how to get shelter really quickly because you're not protected by the trees, you're not protected by anything. So the hut sits just a little ways outside of that. And so we'd stop there, we all had lunch, did our, once again, hide behind this rock for a bathroom break, and then we made the final couple pushes up to the summit. So we would do, right after the hut, we go through Lake of the Clouds, which was really cool. There's these two big lakes that are like hiding up there. And they're just really pretty. They're, just completely look like glass and reflecting the clouds and everything around you. You walk between those and then you keep going up a little bit. And then your final thing is the longest half mile of your life, as our guide told us. And it does, it's like, a half mile, whoop-de-doo. It's not a big thing. The snow at this point was deep enough where you're punching what you call a post hole, where when you step down, you make like a hole with your legs. So you might step down and it might be a few inches up your ankle, and you might step down and it's up to like your hip. And all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I gotta like climb back out of this hole that I've just made and then keep going. So it takes a lot of extra energy. You're also going between walking on like ice, snow, and rock. So each one of those, when you step down, feels a little different because you're walking on, again, knives, basically. And so when you walk on ice and snow, it like crunches in and like really grabs it. When you walk on rocks, it still grabs it, but it's a different feel. And so doing each one of those pieces was interesting to experience as you're going. And then the cool thing also is the guide was going through and explaining the different types of snow. So like at a certain point, he'd pick it up and like throw it at you, and it was like super powdery. The next time he'd throw it at you, it'd be like little tiny like beads or like little balls of snow, like tiny, almost like Dippin' Dots, right? And then he'd give you like the temp, the how much wind, and this and this. And then once you got towards the top, and this is, I've never seen snow like this, they would make these huge like feathers. And we didn't see huge ones, but he said that these like feathers of snow could get up to like 6-8 feet long. Because it would get so windy and so cold and blowing, it would blow and stick the snow, like instead of icicles, they would be like sideways snow icicles, if you will. And they'd look like giant feathers. You could kind of like break them off and whatnot. They were just so cool to look at. And he said, when you get up there, the ones on the buildings, because the buildings don't really move and they're up taller, they get to be really big. So you have to be really careful, because if you get a big snowstorm or if you get too much of a gust of wind, it can knock one of those off and actually knock you out. So you have to kind of stay away from certain sections of buildings so that you don't have a chance of getting knocked out by one of these giant snow feathers. The top is interesting because when you think of a summit of a mountain, you think like there's nothing up there. But because Mount Washington is, I think it's like 6,300 something feet, it's a shorter mountain. It's not thought of as like, you know, some crazy Mount Everest or something like that out in Colorado. It's actually less than half of most of what you see in Colorado, height-wise. But because of that, it makes it interesting. So in the summertime, they have a cog train. There's only, I believe, 2 in America. One that is on Pikes Peak, and then this one that's on Mount Washington, which the one on Mount Washington is the oldest in the country, and you can ride that up to the top in the summer. In the winter, they don't, but they have a big gift shop. They used to have a hotel up there. They have like an old historical museum. All of those are closed down, and then they have the weather station. So at the top, there's always, I believe, 2 or 3 people that live at the weather station for a couple months, and they'll bring them down. And then there's a cat that always lives up there. Right now, the cat's name is Nimbus, and sometimes he gets to go out and play, but we didn't get to see Nimbus this time, but that's always that. And those buildings are completely locked. So you get up to the top, and there's a bunch of buildings that you're hanging out at. It's very pretty. You look out away from the buildings, and it's just gorgeous. And then when you turn around, you're looking at the buildings, and you're like, oh, it's this little tiny little like town kind of thing. So it's unique in that way. But the summit was really cool. We sat down, we had lunch. One of the big things that my aunt taught me was when she used to do adventure racing was that a Snickers bar is almost as calorie and nutrient as healthy as a protein bar, and it tastes better. So we carried Snickers. So all of us sat down and we had our like summit Snickers. And that's been a tradition ever since my aunt kind of taught me that, was to take a Snickers bar onto my trail. And when I've made it to like the top point, stop and have the Snickers bar. One problem is they do freeze. So once you're getting close, it's not a bad idea to throw it inside your jacket. So it does start to heat up a little bit. But we did that, we hung out. And then we started, after a little bit, turning around and going back down because there was a storm that was coming in. We wanted to make sure we were below tree line before that storm hit, just in case it created something at the top that was like not very safe to be in. Coming down, you're using slightly different muscles. That's more of like quad dominant, so like the front of your legs versus the back of your legs. Or, I mean, you're still using quads going up, but it's just different. It's a little harder on the knees. Kind of getting your placement going down with your footing is a little different. We started in the daytime. It was still really nice and bright, but which actually was really cool because we knew there was a storm coming in, and our guides knew the mountain range really well. So he was able to say, hey, I know that peak is 15 miles from where we're standing right now. And so he was watching the clouds and the storm roll over top of each mountain. So he was giving us a, hey, it's over this, it's 15 miles from us right now. We probably have X amount of time until that hits us. And then we were continuing down while we were still in the Alpine area, and you could see it rolling closer. Okay, that one's 10 miles from us. So it's made those 5 miles over, maybe it was a half hour or an hour. So it's moving, at a certain speed. And so we need to like make sure that we're kind of hustling down. Now, we knew that the storm coming in was going to be like a rainstorm. So the main thing we were worried about is maybe a little bit of lightning, but really just getting wet. With the temperatures, because it was warmer, we weren't super worried about getting wet and then freezing and getting in trouble that way. And we all had rain gear of some sort. So we all had I was in a waterproof jacket and I had waterproof pants. So I didn't get wet. It rained on us, but I wasn't wet. By probably about 3 o'clock, we were down in the trees at this point, and it started getting dark. And so it started getting darker. So we, at probably about closer, 4 was when it started getting dark enough where we threw headlamps on. And then probably we were out by 5 o'clock. So between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, we were hiking, not in total darkness, but it's down in the trees. You've got the headlight on and you need it to see. And so a little bit of it's like you're trying to keep up with the flashlights in front of you and okay, where'd they go? And where's the trail? It wasn't too crazy just because it was pretty easy to see this trail and like where we were going. So I wasn't overly worried. There was a few times that we were all spread out enough where I couldn't necessarily see the person directly in front, but I knew there was people behind me coming. So if I had gone off, people would see us. And if we didn't make it to the next spot, they'd be coming back to get us. So it wasn't like we were gonna get lost or we were in trouble or anything. And we were following the river. There was pretty much a river we were going down next to, and we just knew to stay near that and go by that. We waited for the last hiker off the trail. Not everybody did. A lot of people took off right away, and we said like, no, we're not until everyone's off the trail, we're not leaving the group. So we waited probably another half hour to 45 minutes, just like chilling at our car. Once those guys got out, we ran over, big hugs, and we're like, all right, let's go to dinner. And a bunch of us actually met up back at the hotel and met for dinner at a local place and hung out and talked about it. And, at that point you spent 8 hours with someone doing something pretty strenuous. So you have sharing photos and, bonding and it was just cute. Like it was just like some inside jokes and having fun that way with it. So I think my first thing once I was done was looking at flights and figuring out when I could come back and do it again. And actually I did shortly after that. But something I did was I went home and I made a spreadsheet of the mountain. My favorite equipment, my least favorite equipment, the date I did it, the weather, the experience I had. And so now I have that, and I have Mount Washington in there twice, and oh my gosh, I can't think of the one out in Colorado, but I did one out in Colorado as well. And from there, it was the list of what's next. I started researching and collecting and figuring out the next step. So my next step is gonna be Mount Baker, which is out in Washington State. And it's gonna be a 3-day adventure, and I'm actually gonna sleep on a glacier when I'm out there, which is gonna be really cool. And then from there, it's kind of heading towards learning how to do some of the 7 summits, which is the tallest summit in each continent. So I don't wanna do them all, but I wanna at least put a couple of them under my belt. I don't think I want to do Mount Everest. I don't think so. I think it's very commercialized. I think there's a lot of things, a lot of politics to it, and who knows? But the ones on my list are gonna be Africa, that's Kilimanjaro. That one is something that I would really like to do eventually. South America, and I can't remember the exact name, but it's Anacoga, something like that. And then I wanna do Denali, or Mount McKinley, which is in Alaska, and that is the United States tallest. So then from there, training-wise, I'm gonna do Baker, work my way up to Rainier. I would love to do as many of the 14,000 footers in Colorado, and then, I don't know, go from there and see where it leads me.